All right, today we're doing something a little different. We're going to conduct a deep forensic analysis of just a single verse from the Qur'an, one that at first glance presents a fascinating paradox. We're going to treat the text like a primary source document, really digging into all the layers to see how it all fits together. So let's dive right in. So, this is it. This is the verse at the very heart of our analysis. Surah Maryam, verse 11. Now, on the surface, it seems to describe a pretty simple interaction, but as we're about to see, a closer look reveals a really interesting theological and linguistic puzzle that just begs for a deeper investigation. So here's our roadmap for this analysis. First, we'll lay out the verse and the paradox it presents. Then, we're going to decode a key Arabic word that is absolutely central to this puzzle. After that, we'll compare two different accounts of the same event from different parts of the Quran, trace the chain of revelation described in the text, and finally, we'll put all the pieces together into one cohesive timeline. Okay, let's start by setting up the central problem. It's what you might call a classic case of an apparent contradiction that you only spot when you're reading really closely. You have a divine command for silence, immediately followed by an act of communication. So the question is, how can both of those things be true? Here's the verse itself. It describes the prophet Zechariah coming out of his sanctuary and communicating with his people. Now, the key action here is that Arabic word oha, which gets translated in a few different ways, like revealed or indicated. But we can't just look at this action in a vacuum. We have to consider it alongside a critical piece of context from elsewhere in the scripture. And here is the complication. According to a related passage over in another chapter, Surah Al-Imran, Zechariah had been given a sign from God, and as part of this sign, he was explicitly commanded not to speak to anyone for 3 whole days. And that brings us right to the core of our forensic investigation. If Zechariah was under a divine order to be silent, then how in the world did he then come out and communicate a message to his people? This is the paradox we have to resolve, and we're going to do it by only using the text's own internal evidence. You know, the key to this kind of puzzle, as is so often the case in this kind of rigorous textual analysis, lies in the precise meaning of a single, really powerful word. So let's decode waha and see what it can tell us about what really happened here. So that word, awa, is often just translated as revelation, but its actual semantic range, its field of meaning, is much, much broader than that. It really signifies a swift, a subtle kind of indication. And crucially, it doesn't have to be verbal at all. This linguistic nuance is the very key that unlocks the paradox, because it suggests communication can happen entirely beyond the spoken word. So what are we talking about here? What could this nonverbal aha actually look like in practice? Well, scholarly analysis points to a few possibilities in this specific context. Zechariah could have used physical gestures, right? A sign. He might have written the instruction down, maybe on a tablet or even just in the sand. Or it could even refer to a kind of non-discursive inspiration, a message passed directly from the prophet to the hearts of his people. And it turns out we find some incredibly compelling corroborating evidence for this nonverbal idea back in Surah Al-Imran. The verse there says that Zechariah was to communicate, quote, except by rams. Rams is an Arabic word that specifically means a sign or a gesture. So the scripture itself gives us the interpretive clue we need, confirming exactly how he communicated. Okay, so now that we've established the linguistic data, we can move on to the next phase of our analysis. We're going to compare the two different accounts of this event, the one in Surah Maryam and the one in Surah Al-Imran, to see how they actually integrate into a single, cohesive narrative. When you put these passages right next to each other, you see they're not repetitive at all. They actually have very different narrative perspectives. Surah Maryam is focused on the external event, Zechariah's communication outward to his people. But Surah Al-Imran, it focuses on the internal event, the angel's communication inward to Zechariah, while he's still inside the sanctuary. This shows a common literary technique in the Quran, where different passages will illuminate different facets of the very same story. So the crucial point here is this: they aren't contradictory, not in the slightest. The analytical resolution is that they are complementary. They're two parts of a single, continuous event, and reading them together gives us a much richer, more complete view of what happened than either account could provide on its own. Now, to really grasp this synthesis, we need to map out the theological framework for how divine communication is shown to work in this context. It's not presented as a single act, but as a structured, almost procedural chain of revelation. So the process unfolds in stages. First, you have the divine will, the initial promise to Zechariah. Second, you have angelic intermediaries who deliver that message to the prophet. This is the scene inside the sanctuary that's detailed in Al-Imran. And third, the prophet, acting as a divinely guided agent, then conveys the necessary instruction to his people, and that is the nonverbal wahy that we see in Maryam. It shows the prophet not just as a passive receiver, but as an active communicator working within divine parameters. All right, we now have all the pieces of evidence: the initial paradox, the linguistic key, the complementary narrative accounts, and the theological framework. So let's assemble them all to reconstruct a complete, synthesized chronology of the entire event. So here is the reconstructed sequence of events. First, while Zechariah is inside the prayer chamber, angels deliver the good news and the command of silence. That's the Al-Imran account. Next, he emerges, bound by that divine sign, unable to speak. Finally, once he's outside the sanctuary, he performs the ishara, a nonverbal gesture, the rams, to instruct his people. And that's the Maryam account. And there we have it. The paradox completely dissolves. The two accounts are not at odds at all. They are perfectly sequential parts of a single story. One passage details the divine message Zechariah received, and the other details the human nonverbal instruction he gave. A forensic reading doesn't reveal a contradiction, but a text with remarkable internal consistency and narrative depth. You know, this analysis of just one verse really demonstrates how these apparent textual problems can be resolved when you apply a rigorous methodology, examining the language, comparing parallel accounts, and understanding the text's own internal framework. And that leaves us with a final question. How many other complex texts, scriptural or otherwise, contain puzzles that aren't actually contradictions, but are really invitations to a deeper, more forensic analysis?